Yeah, I know the guy. Oh, this guy was saying these guys, his Cardinals, two main guys are not 30. Yeah.
He was up there with like 5 years.
Yeah.
Joe Walsh. He wasn't one of the new guys. Springsteen, I was in the fighters, and the last thing they were public domain of Joe Walsh. And I find it that video to say, man, Rusty Anderson. They pulled it. They don't have a lot of questions.
Oh, cool. I've seen him. Nice job. Yeah.
We're gonna go somewhere.
Yeah, Rusty Anderson.
This is my beer. Yeah. I'm drinking paints and beach water. It's alright. Wasn't in my rider. You can pass out to the other emergency contact. It's all about from Whittier, so drinking water is horrible. At least this one you get some fluoride. Yeah, exactly.
And if he does that and he still can't access it, then he's not waiting on because it could be that he's setting it and it's like, oh, it's not too flag or something.
It's fixed. Hey, Steve. Steve, you send me an email?
So he worked.
All right, we're gonna start up again. They're all post-lists. Dude, I'm gonna show you mine. Mine is possible too, and I'm gonna admit it too. Is everybody here yet? Just wait a minute. Hope people just ran off back there.
Yes.
So I'm going to talk about one of my favorite things in the whole wide world, which is podcasting. I'm Jason Tucker. I'm an ex-podcaster. I used to podcast for quite a few years and helped other people start, setting up their own podcasts and such. I used to be the president of OC Podcasters, kind of like a meetup like this, but for podcasting. And slowly but surely, that type of meetup became me teaching WordPress. So I ended up just coming in and starting, doing WordPress stuff. Who out here doesn't know what a podcast is? Don't know what a podcast is? Okay. How many of you listen to podcasts daily? Anyway, daily? How about weekly? Weekly podcasts? All right. Okay. So what a podcast is it can be an audio or a video file, and essentially that's in iTunes. If you're on a Mac or PC, you can load up iTunes and take a look at it. And what it is it's a bunch of audio or video files, and they're presented in such a way that they're in a RSS feed. You know what RSS feeds are? A lot of us use those quite a bit. And what it does is it takes iTunes organizes all of these podcasts. So what happens is if I want to start a podcast, I create a podcast. I go through all this stuff I'm going to explain in a few minutes here, and I'm going to submit the podcast to iTunes. When you submit the podcast to iTunes, what you're doing is you're telling iTunes, which is essentially a overglorified RSS reader. What? Of sorts.
Blasphemy.
To go in and organize that, and it's going to go and show you all the audio and video files, and make it so that they're available on your iPod, your iPhone, iPad, whatever.
Where do you do that?
Where do you do that?
In iTunes.
It's funny, iTunes loves to hide stuff,
Yes, it does.
and usually they put it at the very bottom, or they put it right here on the side.
We'll submit a podcast, okay.
Yep. So what you do is, that's all it wants. It wants just your RSS feed and that's it. Nothing else.
What if you are working with somebody that has a bunch of audio and you don't know if they've already been submitted?
Well, then you do a search for them in iTunes to find
If
the
they changed
podcast.
servers and they gave you all their stuff, would you have to re-register them with iTunes?
Well, you
Doesn't
can,
it have?
if you try to register something that's already registered, I'd imagine it will probably tell you it already exists in there because it's basing it off of the RSS feed. Now, mind you, podcasts, there's some podcasts that have 5 or 6 different versions of it because they're trying to accommodate for everybody. They'll have a MP3 file, they'll have an Vorbis file, they'll have an AIFF. No, they wouldn't do that, but all these really big, crazy file formats. And they're trying to make it so that it'll work on anything, Linux, Mac, Windows, whatever. Or all these different podcasts or MP3 players and such. So I'm going to show you the basics of what a podcast is in terms of WordPress. I'm not going to show you how to record. I'm not going to show you how to do any of that stuff. If you want to talk to me about that, no problem. I'll be able to sit down and explain that to you. So here's my podcast RSS feed. And as you can see, it redirected us over to FeedBurner, which is what I was expecting. And what I'm going to show you is a couple different fields in this RSS feed. Now, back in the day, people would code their RSS feeds by hand for podcasts. And they would go through and set up all of the various enclosures and that sort of thing. So you have this media enclosure that's right here. And what this does is this is my MP3 file on my server. Now what's happening is it's actually being redirected through Google. because what I'm doing is I'm using Google's feed proxy to determine how many times people are actually clicking on the MP3 file, or playing the MP3 file, or downloading the MP3 file. So there's a couple different pieces in here. We have to look at the actual RSS feed because we're not looking at it. There we go. There we go. That makes more sense. Okay, so what iTunes did is they came up with their own bits of information here in the RSS feed. So you have the feed address. In this case, this is the new feed address. You have the subtitle, the summary, the keywords, and then our actual image that we're using on the podcast itself. If we go back over to iTunes. Not my computer, sorry. It has a couple different windows going on here. There we go. All right, so if we go into iTunes, we can look at a few things here. So this file right here is actually being referenced from so this right here, this image tag here is where this file is being referenced. So if I were to load up this here, you can see there's our logo. And this logo actually gets sucked in and displayed on your iPhone, iPod, whatever your player is that you're using. And there's different file sizes. This podcast is actually kind of old. The newer ones are doing them up to 800 by 800 just so it looks really good on an iPhone or an iPad. So other bits of information in here that are that the plugin that I'm going to be showing you generates is you can see that we have the author, you have the you want to block it. I have to look that up. I'm not quite sure what that is from. And then whether or not it's explicit. And the explicit is, if you do want your kids to be able to listen to podcasts that have bad language or anything like that, you can block that stuff. And actually block it in iTunes so it doesn't actually work on your iPhone or iPad or whatever your player is. I think that's the pretty much the information that you need to know regarding the RSS feed. Now, what's nice about WordPress now is all that's built in.
I got your password. We got your password.
That's cool.
It's bullet.
It's bullet. All right, so I have a lot of plugins installed in here, but the plugin that I was using at the time here is a plugin called PodPress. Now, if you look, there's Blueberry makes one, which is a podcasting aggregator, I guess you would call them. There's quite a few of them. I'm just going to show you this one in particular since I have quite a bit of experience with it. So what you do is we're going to now set up the podcast. So I've installed the plugin. We get to this point where it says, all right, let's fill in this information. I don't know what my podcast ID number is yet, but I will soon. We've moved our podcast around a couple times, so I made a feed just for the podcast category. This is the summary, like I was showing you in that iTunes, those various tags in the RSS feed. And then there's our graphic, and so on and so forth. Now when you get down to the categories, these are actually the categories that you're telling iTunes I'm going to be using these particular categories to put my podcast in these different categories here. So this is a health and fitness podcast, so we have health, fitness, and then technology, so we're geeky and we do technology stuff. Let's see about block uses. If you know you're creating a podcast, you want to remove from iTunes. Okay, that's what that's for. So once you've gone through and set all this up, this has actually changed quite a bit since the last time I've looked at this. But what ends up happening is now we've set up essentially the header of that RSS feed that has to do with the actual podcast itself. Now each podcast, at least in our case, each episode has its own post on the site. Now, lately, now that you can do different post types and such in WordPress, you can utilize that. Since we're kind of grandfathered, we're stuck with the way that we're doing it. This is how we're doing it. So what I end up doing is we write out our show notes on the podcast, and we paste them in here because unfortunately Google doesn't really index audio. So you want to get as much information as you can in your show notes here, so that way people can do searches on your site and you're able to have those show notes available like on your iPhone when you're listening to a podcast. Now the show notes can be, I usually put the show notes in here, but I also put them in iTunes, which I'll show you that in a few minutes here. Scroll down a little bit. There's actually some information regarding this particular episode of the podcast. So here's the URL to that MP3 file. We have the title, and then you have the different types of files that you can use. So a podcast can actually use any of these types of files that are listed here. That doesn't mean that they're going to be able to be played on any and all, podcast playing devices, MP3 players and such. But there are, you can come up with different feeds for this, and that's something I can show you in a bit. Let's see here. So all this information can be set up here, so that way when it writes out all of the, all of the metadata within the RSS feed, it'll be displayed in there, and the appropriate podcatcher will grab that information and use it. Now, if we go over to okay, so the way that a lot of podcasters go about doing their hosting of their MP3 files is sometimes they'll end up using like a CDN, or they'll use an outside source that will host the file. Now, if you're cheap and you wanted to just host your file someplace, you don't really care how long it takes for somebody to download it or anything like that, archive.org actually gives you free hosting space that you can put an MP3 file up there, and you can put in the base address for that, that web address there. So that way you don't have to go and recode the files if you ever want to move your MP3 file elsewhere. So what we did is I just set up an A record here for media.geekfit.com, and that's where we host all of our files. If we ever want to move it or anything like that, I just go in here and change it one time instead of having to change it in all of our episodes. You can also put in the path if you're actually hosting it locally on the server that your web host is at. There's a lot of statistics stuff that's involved in this as well. You can use various websites like PodTrack and Blueberry, and there's a few others as well where you can kind of tell the file to redirect through their servers, which they'll keep track of how many downloads you've had and that sort of thing. PodPress itself actually does statistics as well. I can show you that. So if we look over here, you can see that our stats of how many times they've been downloaded to our feed through the web interface, played on the web interface, and then the total of them being played off the site. There's some other statistics on here where you can see number of downloads that you've had for each particular MP3 file that's listed here. Our show's it's been around for a long while, so what ends up happening with podcasts is people love to go and look at your oldest stuff and work their way through all the podcasts you recorded. Our stuff is evergreen because it's about health and fitness, so it's really easy for somebody to want to go through and listen to all the stuff. If it was a news podcast, I'd imagine maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and then after that, no one will end up, going through your old archives. No one wants to listen to old news. Let's see here. Do you have any questions regarding this portion of it before I get into like the meat and potatoes of iTunes?
Have you looked at the other plugins?
Yes.
And
there's quite a few of them. They all do the same thing for the most part. I mean, they literally what's ended up happening is you're taking this information and you're dumping it into an RSS feed. That part of it is all around. They're doing the exact same thing. Presentation-wise, the way that they're setting up the meta boxes and the post fields and that sort of thing, they're all different. Sure, we probably all go about it a little bit different. But for the most part, you could even do a podcast without using any of this stuff. You could go into a post, create a new post, and just reference an MP3 file. And then what I'm using is PodPress. And what PodPress does is it'll read through my RSS feed, and if it notices an MP3 file, it will create an enclosure for that MP3 file for me automatically. So I don't have to do anything extra. It just automatically does it.
You mean if you put it in that container?
Yeah, you just put,
just do it.
.com/whatever/ we just make a link to it. And there's that's whatever.com/wherever I'm storing it, and then the file name. Do you follow? So by putting that, putting this in here, what happens is PodPress is going to go through, or not PodPress, sorry, FeedBurner is going to go through and take this. I may have said PodPress earlier, and that's probably why you're confused. It'll take FeedBurner, the service that Google provides, will go through and it'll look for this MP3 file, and if it sees an MP3 file, it'll take it and put it as an enclosure in the RSS feed.
When you register at FeedBurner, you're not registering every MP3.
No,
Are
you're
you
registering your
every
RSS
episode?
feed.
It's for every
No, you're just the podcast.
Just the podcast.
Just
so
the
podcast is one thing, and then the episodes are all the different MP3s, right?
Now that would only not be true if it was multiple file formats. So if you had, say you got a video podcast, and you wanted to expand out and make it so that audio people could listen to the podcast as well, and not have to download some big, huge video file. But you cut out the audio track, you make another MP3 file, and you stick it on there. Make a whole other RSS, you can go through here and set it up. Make a whole other RSS feed, maybe like a category or
a
something.
separate FeedBurner feed?
Separate FeedBurner feed.
Okay, because
right.
those are all the same thing. An RSS and a FeedBurner feed are the same.
Correct.
And from what I understand, like when you use these different services, some of them aren't a good idea to use because if you try to move them, they won't let you move them.
Right.
And is that why you're using PodPress? Because you're bypassing that?
I'm using PodPress because I'm used to it. So I'm able to organize out all that information that's there. I'm readying myself just in case Google were to ever go out of business. That sort of thing. Because what happened is FeedBurner actually got acquired by Google, and people were freaking out when FeedBurner was about ready to go down, and Google just scooped them up.
You're not using FeedBurner?
I am using FeedBurner.
You are, but
What I'm saying is
your files on your server.
Right. I started out without using FeedBurner, and I knew that, or I had a feeling that something could happen with
Exactly.
FeedBurner, and so that's why I went through painstakingly went through all of my posts, and made sure that that it had all of the information in there per episode. in FeedBurner, or in WordPress.
So you're putting all the information in there and not using a tag editor on your file? You know,
This thing generates the RSS feed for me. WordPress generates RSS feeds for you. And actually it generates it for every category, all those things. The category, the whole site itself, including all of the categories, however you want to slice and dice it. So the way that I've seen people do their custom RSS feeds for their podcasts is they'll set up a different category. They'll have a category called high quality, MP3 file, low quality MP3 file, high quality video file, low quality video file.
and those are separate podcasts.
And those are separate podcasts, separate RSS feeds. And then if you go into the FeedBurner thing like I'm using, you do separate FeedBurner setups.
Mhm. And then the visitor has to choose which one they want.
Correct.
They have to at least know that one.
Correct.
Okay.
So if I go back to like the front page of the site here, this thing comes with a couple different widgets and stuff. And this widget that's right here, you can actually create different RSS feed links that will. Let me see that. It's right here. feedfit.com/feed/podcast. This is essentially my category. So I can have a category called video, category called high quality video, low quality video, whatever, and set those all up so they each have their own posts.
On the
In different
non-technical
formats.
side, are you recording these or just doing, who's producing the audio?
Oh, I am. Yeah, I use GarageBand to record, talking to the
Are you interviewing people or
microphone.
what are you doing?
What am I doing?
Are you interviewing people or?
My friend and I, he lives up in Washington, and I live here. And I just I use a plugin for Skype called Call Recorder. It's by Ecamm software, and you load up Skype and just hit record in there, and it just hijacks the audio right off of the Skype signal, and records it. You can use Audio Hijack Pro. It's another one that's really great. You can pull in various audio feeds into it. The Mac's great for that. I've done recording on Windows, like Audacity is another application that I've used in the past for doing recordings.
Can you set up this podcast to expire or lock after a certain date or certain time? For example, if you're selling some sort of services and you want to make sure they're not going to give that class to someone else, if it's, for example,
Right.
online.
So you're talking like
Can
a
you-
premium podcast, something that you charge for.
Yeah.
Sure. There's a couple different services that will do that sort of thing. I don't remember off the top of my head, but there's a couple different premium podcast services.
Okay.
That
Is
essentially
that-
they'll lock up that RSS feed and make like some special token that is added into the RSS feed that the person would then copy that RSS feed address, manually put it into iTunes, and now they have access to it.
But you wouldn't be able to self-host that. You'd have to host it.
You can host all the audio files and everything yourself if you
Oh,
want.
really?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yep.
How nice for them.
Yeah. But if somebody knows what that web address is to that particular file, then you get messed up. But if you didn't want to host them, those places even do hosting themselves. They'll encode that web address to be just for that particular user and only that user. You can roll your own. You can do within WordPress. They've added some additional features in here. It's not this is. Yeah, enable premium content. And there's a whole thing regarding that, where you can set up a premium feed and use A-Member Pro and PayPal and all that sort of thing.
Great.
But there's other services out there as well that do that sort of thing too, where you can use this and kind of roll your own a little bit. Let's see here. So that's just being able to actually access the podcast through iTunes. So if we go over to here, you can also see that we have a player that's on that's on here. This is just I think this is using an HTML5 player. It used to be just Flash. But if you click on it, what ends up happening is you can hear our intro music.
But it's not so much.
And you can hear us talking and stuff. And then there's, a couple little gadgets on here that you can control. There's versions of this. Like for instance, if you wanted to, you can do a pop-up. So you get a nice clean pop-up that you can listen to. So if you're at work or whatever, you want to listen to the podcast, you can listen to it that way. You can also just download the MP3 file if you don't really know what you're doing, but you want to be able to, take that MP3 file and play it using some other mechanism. You can do that too. So now all this I've been talking about is mainly regarding iTunes. The reason why I haven't mentioned any other players is I maybe seen maybe 5 or 10 downloads from these other players that are out there. Like there's a couple different ones that were just like off-name brands that came up with their own little podcasting solution. And no, they didn't really catch on. We even went, through the trouble of setting up ours in the Zoom Marketplace or whatever they called it, which looks like it doesn't even exist anymore, to pull that up. So, the Zoom was supposed to be a pretty big thing, and we ended up not going that route. But let's see. Now, the other thing that iTunes does for podcasts is they do this iTunes preview thing, which they do this for you've probably seen it on apps, on video files, TV shows, that sort of thing. You can go out here and listen to the podcast and see if you like it before you actually go and download it. There's other things that people have listened to about that's like our show. That's that so far.
Does iTunes give you any demographics of who listens to it?
No. iTunes, it's really hard to even communicate with them. You can get, for instance, say if your podcast feed got messed up or you moved the site from one host to another or something like that. You could go in there and submit the podcast again, and you may end up with it twice. That's why they added that little feature that's showing in the RSS feed, indicating where you're going to relocate the RSS feed to some other service. But other than that, iTunes does not communicate with you unless you're a huge podcast and you're being featured on like the front page of their site or the front page of within this here. Like these guys right here were contacted saying, hey, we need you to come up with a graphic that we can use on the front page of the site. That's going to be some type of communication with iTunes. Other than that, it's a one-way street. I've never been contacted by them or anything like that. I've even heard of really big podcasters that used to go to my Meetup that almost were never contacted by iTunes. Any other questions?
That's why you're using FeedBurner to keep track of the stats.
Right. So yeah, so the stats part. Yeah, I can get into the stats part of it.
I concur with that, by the way. You're not going to be able to contact anybody.
No.
It's a big machine.
It's a bot.
No.
He still lives.
See if this works. There we go. So there's different podcasts that I've either started or I've done something with or what have you. If you go in here, you can see like the number of subscribers that you have. You can see the number of downloads that you've had recently.
So these are people that subscribe to your podcast, not through iTunes.
No, this is through anything. Whatever method they're going about.
Because you're using FeedBurner.
Huh?
You're looking at FeedBurner.
Right. So what happens is that I guess the hierarchy of this would be that you have whatever your player is that you're going to be using. It could be iTunes, it could be, if you have an Android device, there's a player for the Android devices. Let's just assume there's mini players, right? Those mini players connect to my website and download, or they go through and look at the RSS feed that's on my site. My site is set up to forward all that traffic to FeedBurner. FeedBurner then keeps track of the number of downloads, the number of clicks, so on and so forth, through that RSS feed that they generate for me based on my information. When somebody goes and downloads that file, it actually redirects through FeedBurner again back to my site and downloads the file. So they're keeping track of the number of downloads, I'm keeping track of the number of downloads. And there's actually a third service that I could use that can keep track of the downloads as well. So between all three of those, they're redirecting 3 times till it finally gets to that MP3 file. And you can only go 3 times. After 3 times, your podcatcher, whatever it is, gives up and says, no, I'm not redirecting that many times. That's just ridiculous. So I tried to go through all the services just to see, what's the stats are, what my stats are, and how's everything working out. And yeah, 3 times and that's it. Now within FeedBurner itself, you can even use FeedBurner for your own website if you wanted to keep track of the feeds and stuff. If we go over to here, there's this SmartCast section.
They're probably cleaning next door. Somebody next door likes to smash things, that's all I know.
So let's assume you didn't use PodPress. Let's assume that all you're doing is you're taking your MP3 file, you're making a link to it on your website, and that's it. And then you went into FeedBurner and said, okay, FeedBurner, here's my RSS feed. Turn it into a podcast. Well, if you look, it's the same type of information that we had in the PodPress interface. So it's going to create the iTunes elements. It's going to use any rich text file or any rich media file. It could be audio, video, photos, whatever. There's my big image again. Here's some information about summary of our podcast. Here's the different types of search keywords I set up. And that's it. So all this information, what ends up happening with the way I have this set up is this overrides anything I put into PodPress. In PodPress, it's in WordPress. This overrides everything because this is the last thing this is the first thing that gets referenced from iTunes. So iTunes will hit PodPress first and get the information from there and fill it in iTunes. So if I go back here, we'll go do a search for GeekFit.
iTunes will hit PodPress first or FeedBurner first?
iTunes is going to hit my website first, forward over to FeedBurner, and FeedBurner is going to have the information that it needs.
And so they're the last ones out and they're the last authority. Okay.
Correct. So if you look in here, go into iTunes, or go into that podcast, you can see this information matches up. So you can see 2007, geekfit.com, go back over here, 2007, geekfit.com. Our name's listed here. I don't think it's on there, but that sort of information shows up on here. So, like I said before, the way that I've set up our podcast is so that if FeedBurner were to ever go down, go away, whatever, I can quickly make a couple little changes in my site and make it so that it'll still just hit my site directly instead of the FeedBurner. Let's see here.
So you could set it up all ahead of time and then come back and register at FeedBurner at the end? Like if
I mean, you don't even have to have FeedBurner involved if you don't want to. The main reason why we had FeedBurner set up is that FeedBurner takes the brunt of the hits. Because what happens is if you had 30,000 people listening to your podcast, subscribed to the podcast, that's 30,000 computers connecting at random times, hitting that RSS feed. Yep. Over and over and over and over and over and over again, however their configuration is. So I'm using FeedBurner as kind of like a cache in a way. So what happens is FeedBurner every once in a while goes out to my site and pulls the RSS feed and says, okay, this is the one I'm going to be using as my RSS feed, the template of it. It goes and makes a couple changes to it, interprets it, and makes its own RSS feed. When I went and subscribed, when I went and put our site or our podcast into iTunes, I actually told it to go to geekfit.com/podcast. Then I took that address and redirected it over to PodPress. So when you hit that site, like just like I was showing you on here, when you go to geekfit.com/feed, you'll see that it redirects over to here. Same with /podcast, we'll redirect over to here as well.
So it takes the brunt of the request,
Right.
but it's not acting like a content.
It's not doing anything with your content. The only thing it's doing is, is keeping track of how many downloads you've had, and then taking that person over to that MP3 file and downloading it. And it tracks all of that whole exchange. So PodPress does tracking, and FeedBurner does tracking. Those numbers never match. ever. They never match. They're pretty darn close, but they never match. When I look at my numbers here, and this number is probably the best number you can get in terms of how many people are subscribing to your podcast. That would be the number to look at, because PodPress doesn't give you that information.
What is reach?
What is reach?
Reach is the total number of people that have taken action, viewed, or clicked on the content you view.
And what's the other number?
Subscribe doesn't do this, and people subscribe.
Yeah, subscribed is the total. Since Google is the internet, essentially, they're keeping track of all the IP addresses, all the everything. So they know all the unique IP addresses that have hit that in X number of days, X number of hours, whatever their metric is that they're using for this. See, total subscribers on average, or just subscribers themselves. There's a lot of information here. If you wanted to play around with the way that FeedBurner works, and you have a really popular website, take a look at FeedBurner and see what information you can get out of it, because it provides quite a bit. Since it's owned by Google, a lot of the information that analytics use and that sort of thing kind of slowly but surely makes its way in. Any other questions regarding like podcasting in general, or how you work with it in iTunes or nothing like that?
Any way to monetize that, Jason?
Monetize the podcast just by content. So put an ad in your audio. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Now I have specific questions.
All right, so for those of you who have left, that kind of, I think for a while, everybody's been talking about maybe like breaking out and doing like actual work. We're here so you can kind of bounce ideas off each other, kind of have a little collaboration type thing. So we want to give it a try. Steve has let us sit around and commune and all this kind of stuff as we want to, and if it makes sense, we can kind of continue doing it. Otherwise, we can go back to regularly scheduled programming. I think kind of what we're thinking is kind of how, for those of you who went to WordCamp OC, like how the second day was, the developer day, where there's really no format. I mean, if you've got something you're working on, and you kind of want to share it with people, that's a good thing to do. I know Shredder was talking about showing me some JavaScript goodness, so I'm going to check that out. But if you have questions, like this group, I mean, I think we've all kind of seen this, but this group is an amazing resource, right? I mean, everybody in here has some knowledge that probably somebody else doesn't. So if there's some fancy trick you know that maybe somebody else might have, might find useful, share it. And I think what's going to come out of this, and this is just from my guess, so I don't know if this is what's going to actually happen, but I think we're going to find that a lot of people have more to contribute, especially the people who usually sit in the crowd but have a lot of WordPress knowledge. Maybe this will be a good stepping stone to get up here one time and present. So yeah, I think for maybe half an hour, whatever you guys want, come up with. I mean, just work amongst yourselves, work with friends, and if something comes out of it that you want to share with the group, maybe we can do that at the end or in the middle or whenever. No format, loose, anything you want.
The coworking session actually sort of informally, accidentally started early today. People were here.
Yeah,
I think 4 o'clock and just set up in the conference room. So there's actually Eric and Anton are talking in the conference room right now about something, and Dave and Brandon were just talking about something. So talk amongst yourselves. It's fun.
Go for it. And spread the word of WordPress. Spread the word.
Not much. How are you?
I'm slacking the board with friends and I've been so busy.
Plus I got scrambled. You got scrambled with friends. Yeah, I haven't gotten into that.
I kind of think this guy, he's a wonderful person, this guy that you got this, and he doesn't charge anything for it. He's done that. He has some other commissions and sometimes he answers questions and he doesn't. So I'm not even going to worry about podcasting or CD right now. That's like, don't even care on the server. And it looks like assistant pastor has been good enough to go in, because here on files, you normally don't see unlinked files are supposed to list. So he's gone in and linked them, so they're all linked up. So now the thing is that what I see is in the dashboard, people are getting these sermons, and I don't know if this 56 file, 56 sermons, he's added pictures, 6 pictures, and they have these little it's pretty robust. And I mean, we've had, it doesn't show it many times, but like there's just this one sermon right here, there 117 times.
Yes.
So this guy comes in.
There's a plug-in for that.
Okay. Probably about your age.
So we just need to pick a spot, huh?
Where was he?
You.
Your presence is required.
What's that multi-site plugin that lets you
And
basically template
but anyway,
your parent site?
I want
You
to-
duplicate when you make it